Hi everyone, this is Kelly, and today we'll look at the social processes underpinning the governance of environmental flows, or Eflows. In her presentation about policies and legislation, Angeles highlighted that Eflows governance was about the rules, the practices and processes that influence decision-making. Well, decisions are made by the different actors involved in the management of a resource. In previous units, we have already touched on the subject of stakeholders' engagement as a key concept of environmental flows management, and on the importance of mapping stakeholders as one of the first steps in the situation analysis. This lecture will go in more detail about the different ways stakeholders are engaged in environmental flows assessment and implementation. What is a stakeholder again? A stakeholder is a party that has a stake or an interest in the resource in question. It can be a group of people like a community, organization or institution, or an individual. A stakeholder has a direct or indirect interest in the project or intervention and can be affected by its implementation and outcomes. And why is it important to involve stakeholders? Well, stakeholders can contribute important skills, knowledge, experience and techniques to the Eflows process. The involvement of stakeholders helps building consensus and reducing the likelihood of conflicts, for stakeholders to trust each other and collaborate more. Their participation increases the sustainability of Eflows because it builds commitment and ownership. It also contributes to transparency in Eflows governance and decision-making. Stakeholders are essential at various stages of an environmental flow process, the assessment and implementation of Eflows. These include setting a vision, objectives, and measurable targets for the desired social ecological condition of the river, socio-economic surveys to assess dependencies of communities on ecosystem services and the suitable flows to sustain them. As Eflows recommendations are taking into a wider water management context, stakeholder engagement remains important in decision-making, also in problem or conflict resolution, implementation, and monitoring and adaptive management. I will go through each stage in the following screens and use examples from the Mara River Basin in Kenya and Tanzania, and Refugee River Basin in Tanzania when possible. Setting a vision, objectives, and measurable targets. At this stage, it is important to integrate societal needs, values, and aspirations to build a shared vision for the water resource. The involvement of stakeholders at this stage is a contributing factor to successful implementation later. In the Eflows assessment for the Mara River, a vision and objectives were set by the Kenyan Water Resource Management Authority, prioritizing ecological use over livelihood and commercial uses of the water resources. Measurable targets were set by the Eflows assessment specialists who participated in the field surveys. They used specific flow and water quality indicators and an A2F classification scheme ranging from natural to highly degraded to determine the current and desired status of the ecosystem. It is important to reflect on the stakeholder engagement strategy used in any Eflows process. In this case, water users and Tanzanian stakeholders were not taken into account enough. Socio-economic surveys. Stakeholder engagement at this stage helps assessing the dependencies of communities on ecosystem services and the suitable flows that sustain them. In an environmental flow study for the Kilombero subcatchment in the Refugee River Basin in Tanzania, a methodology was developed to carry out a social assessment to obtain information on the dependencies on goods and services provided by the ecosystem and the preferred flows to sustain those. Highest preferences were found for domestic water use, flood recession agriculture, and cultivated vegetables and fruits. Other valued services included health control, fishing, fuel woods, and flood mitigation. Given the high dependencies of communities on the natural resources, it is important to note that the social assessment for environmental flows includes more than the human right to water for drinking, cooking, and bathing. Alteration of flows would have a strong impact on people's livelihood in the region. Flow thresholds were identified to sustain the ecosystem services most valued by people. Results of the surveys were also used to assess the social importance and sensitivity of flow alteration at different sites. This conceptual model illustrates how the social dynamics within communities change as a result of changing flow-related ecosystem services throughout the year. In the box highlighted in brown, you can note that fishing and the cultivation of different products vary with increasing and decreasing river discharge. These changes are also shown in relationship to seasonal changes in the ecology of riparian vegetation and fish communities. Understanding the link between flows and the social ecological system is part of an environmental flow assessment. Decision-making. At the stage of integrating Eflows' recommendation within a wider water management framework, stakeholders are needed to analyze trade-offs between different water uses and make decisions. In the Mara River Basin, a wide group of stakeholders, including water users, was then engaged to make decisions in terms of water allocation planning. Stakeholder engagement for problem or conflict resolution is useful for Eflows or other water users. Problems may include transboundary disagreements, conflicts between different water users, or resource competition. Because stakeholders have interests, involvement, and influence on the resource and social ecological system, they should be involved in negotiations. Engaging stakeholders, and especially the water users at this stage, is about letting them identify solutions for finding a balance between competing interests. With moderated discussions, stakeholders can find common ground to negotiate, get consensus, and design mitigations. Implementation. Stakeholders are key to the successful implementation of environmental flows. Water users especially play a key role in the implementation of Eflows by regulating their abstraction according to the water available in the river and their permit restrictions. Management authorities are responsible for controlling the compliance of different water users to the environmental flows and abstraction restrictions. It is important to determine the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders at this process of Eflows implementation. Monitoring and adaptive management is about learning with practice. Stakeholders participate in the different phases of the adaptive management framework during the preparation of the monitoring protocol, the integration of the recommendations into a water allocation plan, the implementation of Eflows, and the monitoring and evaluation of Eflows. In the case of the Mara, the Water Resource Authority Sub-Regional Office and the water users play an important role in monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive management. I will close this lecture by introducing the concept of social learning in water management. The management of water resources is currently undergoing a paradigm shift toward a more integrated and participatory management style for a more effective implementation of management decisions. The concept of social learning consists in recognizing that stakeholders can learn from each other and that management policies and practices can be improved by learning from the outcomes of previous management actions. Key ideas in the concept of social learning include that all stakeholders should be involved and need to collaborate, as none of them have all required information. To enable collaboration, a form of organization is required. For example, through users' organizations, multi-stakeholder platforms, or informal policy networks. Finally, it is a learning process. Cases show that social learning can potentially contribute to better management and be used to mitigate or solve controversial issues, and that when steps toward a truly participatory approach were taken, this resulted in benefits for the stakeholders involved and also for the environment. This slide marks the end of this lecture, and the main take-home messages are: social processes underpin the governance of Eflows. Stakeholders shall be engaged at different stages in environmental flow assessment and implementation. And social learning aims to support efficient Eflows implementation and adaptive management.